Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ProductTank London. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is James, one of the organisers of ProductTank. I'll be your host for this evening. We have a fantastic lineup, so we'll get into that really quickly. Just a little bit of context for those that haven't joined us before. Mind the Product and ProductTank are a global community for people interested in and dedicated to the craft of product management. It's by product people for product people, and it's all about getting involved in whichever way you would like to, whatever way you feel comfortable. So you've already taken a great step by joining us here tonight, but there's lots of other ways that you can do more if you would like to. Please, you can, if you'd like to get involved by speaking at a Product Tank, hosting one, or if, speaking in front of people is less your thing, you'd like to write, get your thoughts down in writing, then we've got loads of great guest articles and blogs and everything on mindtheproduct.com. So yeah, please do drop us a line if any of that sounds interesting. You can also join the biggest product community in the world as a Mind the Product member. We've got lots of different ways for you and your team to get all kinds of information, advice, fantastic insight from around the world these days into product management and how you can level up your career through all of that. So please do get involved however you would like. Tonight we've got three fantastic talks coming your way, all about data analytics, insight, how we can use that to make some better decisions in our products. If as we're going through, you'd like to ask us a question, we've got slido.com running. You can see the code is running along the bottom of the screen. You can see it there as well. Also on YouTube, if you want to type something into the comments, we will do our best to get across that. We're going to have our three speakers each do 15-20 minutes of their sessions, and then we'll do questions for everybody right at the end. So do drop them down in Slido as we go through. We'll then curate a nice Q&A with everybody on screen when we get to that. So let's get into it. First up, we have the fantastic Steph from On Deck, who's going to be talking to us all about how his experience at one of the world's largest no-code organizations or products, I suppose, has been setting up their data and analytics function. So Steph, thanks very much. Over to you.
Thanks, James. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to give a talk. And hi, everyone. I'm Steph. I'm a kind of crossover designer, product technologist person. I've been working in startups for a long time. I ran a design agency for a good few years. And most recently, I've been doing a lot of work in kind of venture building. That's the world I've been in. Recently, I joined On Deck as a senior software engineer, and I've been leading the kind of data function inside the organization. So the topic for my talk today is from no code to data driven. This is going to be a case study in building a data reporting stack for a high growth startup that started out using no code tools. So I'm going to jump in, and this is On Deck. On Deck is a US startup, kicked off really a couple of years ago, but before that was a series of dinners that brought founders and investors and kind of interesting people in the kind of startup ecosystem together to help each other with the kind of idea and generation stage of beginning a new business. And right now, On Deck helps people start a company, find their next role, and invest in their careers. And the way we manifest that is it's a series of learning programs and kind of community events. And essentially, when people join On Deck, you join a cohort of people who are in a similar place to you. So maybe you're thinking about starting a new business, or you're all people who work in climate tech, or perhaps you're an investor and you want to be surrounded by other investors who you want to kind of draw on and build on your thinking. You'll find a different community or program within On Deck that will support you at all those different stages or in those different sectors. It's been a high growth year or so for On Deck. We now have 20 cohort-based programs that we run multiple times per year for founders, investors, and professionals. And it covers a wide variety of things. So you can see here we've got product management, design, community building, health tech, all sorts of interesting areas. And we've got about 7,000 fellows who've joined programs across all of that. And in this last year, when I joined in, I think it was February, we had about 30 people on the team. And to give you a sense of the kind of scale of growth, we've now hit about 250 people on the team. So it's a kind of hyper growth kind of environment. One of our most successful programs is called ODF, On Deck Founders. And through that, we've helped about 400 companies get their first starts, get going with a community of people around them and lots of support and access to investors. And through that, those companies have gone on to raise around $500 million of investment, which is pretty amazing. And I think that shows the kind of strength of the community that is building here. It's a very exciting place to be. And that's culminated this week in an announcement that is fresh off the press that we now have a $100 million community-backed accelerator program that we're going to be running as of January. So I'll give you all this as context, not really a pitch, just to kind of tell you a little bit what we're doing in On Deck. And the way that we express all of that in terms of product is very broad. So to support everything I've just talked about, we have to build a lot of different things. So we've got a directory of all the people in the network, which is like a mini LinkedIn. We've got an investor intro service where we facilitate the connection between investors and founders to see if they'd like to be involved. We've got mastermind groups that we run through the platform. We've got a kind of ecosystem map to help people understand who people are. And then there's video delivery, learning. There's a lot going on. The thing is, when you start a startup, one of the first things that you'll probably be thinking about if it's in tech is how you're going to hire as many engineers as possible to help your vision turn into reality. And when I joined On Deck, I was surprised that the way that it had been built up until that point was kind of the inverse. Up until around Series A in the first quarter of this year, On Deck was mostly run using off-the-shelf no-code tools. So essentially, the team had plugged together Airtable, Slack, Zoom, Webflow, got Typeform forms for getting responses from people, and then automating all of that using like what most people think of as kind of marketing automation tools like Zapier and Integromat, plus a lot more. And one thing that I've learned over the years, and I really admire this about the instinct that the early team at On Deck had before I joined, is that no code is better than no code. Often people think about code as an asset, but in many ways it turns into a liability as you grow because you end up with technical debt and you have to kind of maintain and keep building the code that you've decided on early on, even though it might not apply anymore, or your needs might have changed quite radically. And one thing that I've seen as a kind of big trend online over the last few years is the rise of this kind of no-code approach. So non-technical, non-product people can create user experiences or automations without having to write any code at all. And so along the top of this slide here, there's an example of one of the flows that we have in On Deck. Imagine you're applying to one of the programs. Early this year, it was essentially a type form on a page. You go to the type form, fill in some questions, and then that would insert a row representing all those questions into Airtable, which is a kind of flexible database that multiple team members can collaborate around. It's like a scratch pad. It's very flexible, very malleable. And then when that row is inserted, it automatically sends an email to the person who applied. And then there's a workflow where a team member would then review the application, and if that person looks good for a particular program, they'd approve them. And then they'd make a change in Airtable and automatically would send an invitation to an interview page. And then it might send a payment link and so on and so on and so on. Now, normally, or up until quite recently, you would probably have had to get a service designer or a product designer and a developer to put that flow together for you. And that was not the case. Up until quite recently, the entire kind of user acquisition onboarding funnel was done using low-code tools built by people who are non-technical, which I think is quite astounding, given that we got to that kind of Series A point with it. So wait, I'm not saying that we don't have a centralized product team at On Deck. What I'm showing you here is where we were early on and how the company grew. We do have a centralized kind of product engineering team now, and our role is essentially taking a lot of what's been decided as parts of the product and turning it into user experiences that are more considered, more nuanced, that you can manage using these low-code tools. But you can get a long way with this stuff. And if you fully embrace using a kind of no-code approach, you're implicitly trusting the whole team to contribute to what you might call product, So if you think about product in its widest sense, any touch point that one of your customers has, or any experience that they go through, is really part of the product. That whole design needs to incorporate those things. And by introducing no code, you're essentially pushing a lot of that design to the edge of the organization. Anyone who has any contact with an end user is potentially a designer of one of those experiences, rather than it being decided by a central team that is probably a bottleneck. And so you're unlocking the capacity of the team, and you're enabling everything to go much faster. So that's what we optimize for. We optimize for growth, and we optimize for great experience. Essentially, early on deck was a kind of concierge service where we would manually process the way that fellows interacted with the programs, and we're optimizing for making sure that it grew quickly to support the ambitions of what we wanted to do. This is where I'll stop selling the kind of low code piece, because the minute you get to a certain point with this stuff, you're suddenly faced with a high degree of complexity. I've talked about all the different aspects of what on deck includes, all the different pieces of the pie, all the different mini products within the product we want to build. And essentially, as we've grown, it's like we've been blowing into balloon. The surface area has been expanding and expanding and expanding on what we would define as product, to the point where it's hard to reason about. It becomes unmanageable, and it's hard for the teams to know who's doing what and what's responsible for certain things. But low code, there's a lot to like. You can get to value very quickly with it. You can be very responsive. When something changes, you just change a rule, you add a new automation, you deprecate the old one. There's tight feedback loops between you and the customer, and people who are non-technical can be the authors of those experiences. And a crucial thing to bear in mind here is that once you build something using a low-code tool, you don't have to maintain it yourself. You're kind of paying for the service of maintenance by the people who maintain their platform, which I think is very powerful. And also, because you're using something off the shelf, you can draw on their training. And at a fundamental layer, the pricing is more predictable. You know what you're getting. You don't have to think about the variability of estimates of a tech team or a design team. You get what you're paying for. So where we got to by the beginning of this year was that pretty much everything was being run by that Airtable setup that I was describing. We had it doing all sorts of things, like a CRM. It's running operational workflows, even using for analytics and reporting. Lots of business logic was in there. It's kind of an all singing, all dancing, does everything kind of well system. And if you're anything like me, that probably makes you feel a bit nervous. This is an amazing setup for growth and flexibility, but it's pretty scary for a product person to be thinking about this kind of stuff. So some questions that I faced when looking at this as a new joiner in the team is, how do you measure what's going on in a system where everything's tied together with kind of automations? It's impossible to know what triggers what and why certain things happen with that complex system. You end up with inconsistent data where you might have some information in one service, like a type form, synced into another thing like a Google Sheet, but sometimes those syncs don't work and you end up with data in one place and not the other, and that can cause real problems. And so many data sets, so many different places where information lives, rather than it being in a centralized database, can cause problems. And on top of that, because the complexity was growing and growing and growing, we were using more and more automations, to the point where we've got thousands of Zap automation rules in Zapier, the kind of tool of choice. And even that's hard to reason about. We don't have any consistent schemas on how we're representing data. So everything's like slightly differently named everywhere. And debugging all of it becomes hard because of everything I just said, basically. So wait, one thing that if you're coming from a developer kind of products background, you suddenly realize when you work in a low-code world is pretty much everything is in production all the time. There's no inbuilt sense of a test staging or production workflow. You're dealing with live data being plugged into other places where live data is needed, and that's inherently dangerous. So what do we do to solve that? If you're doing low code at scale or going to get to scale, I would advise looking at having a low code infrastructure team. And they solve all those problems I've just talked about. We've come up with kind of innovative ways to reduce the risk on everything I've just said there. And those things are surmountable. I won't go into all of that right now, but the thing is that what we did is we centralized a small team who knew all about low-code tools and how things were plugged together, and they owned the support task of helping the rest of the team kind of de-risk the whole process, and that's been very effective. So zooming out a bit, if you're coming from the world where you're used to working with developers and designers to code and build services, there's now a kind of range that you can look at about how you build things. So no code, the stuff that I've just talked about, users being kind of team members being in control of how product is built, is great for product ops, where there's a high degree of touch point between users and team members. And that's the kind of thing you should buy off the shelf, in my opinion. There's loads of generic things you can buy there that are cheap and powerful. There's a mixed ground with low code where you're using some of these tools, but then you're configuring them with code. And that's where you've got bespoke logic needed. You want to kind of do something that's slightly unusual or slightly within just your domain. That's a good place to put your kind of low code thinking. And then what the whole process has enabled us to do is to really focus the limited engineering resources we've got on the secret sauce, the stuff that really matters, the IP of the business. And that's where you focus all your build efforts. So let's talk about the kind of fascinating topic of data pipelines. So when I joined OnDeck, one of the first things I did was set up a data function, a data team, to try and solve some of these issues around not being able to find where information is and how it's plugged together. I'm not going to talk about product analytics too much because I'm sure you're all familiar. We obviously added segment and full story and Google Analytics and Mixpanel on front of our web app that we were building and the web apps that were part of the system, but that's only part of the solution. Web analytics kind of gives you, if you think about the life cycle of someone joining a kind of educational experience like what we're talking about, only really helps at the kind of top end where someone visits, they apply, and they convert into a paying user. We couldn't find a way to use those analytics tools in the actual operations or the experience of being in part of a program. We need a different approach. And all of these things are held within low-code tools. That's where that data is. So what we did is set up a warehouse where we would, where we would direct all of our data, set up a process where we clean it and make it standardized, which is pretty hard, and combine all those different data sources from different locations and make it all accessible to the team. That was the plan. And we chose a data warehouse called Snowflake, which is one of the kind of big 3 or 4 data warehouse tools. Essentially, it's a big database that is designed specifically for answering analytics questions. It's really good at crunching large amounts of data. It doesn't do it particularly fast, but it does it accurately and can hold a lot of information. I'm sorry for this kind of jumbly looking diagram, but I think this is a good way of explaining like what we've done. Essentially, we've got all these disparate tools with kind of part of the picture of how people experience the product or their experience of OnDeck. And what we wanted to do was be able to get a cross-cutting view across all of that. So the answer is, for each one of these tools, you make an ingest rule. You take each one of them in turn and you plug it into a data pipeline where you ingest the data, clean it, push it into Snowflake, and then that is then made available to a business intelligence tool. In this case, we chose Metabase or Airtable, where a lot of the team are already working. And this gets a bit meta, but we're essentially using low-code data tools to load data from low-code tools into other low-code tools, if you see what I mean. We've essentially got off-the-shelf services which are specifically designed to move data around from place to place. And we decided not to even invest in building our own code here, just using off-the-shelf tools as well. And these are great. These 4 on the screen here, I'd really recommend you taking a look at if you're facing similar issues. So the process we go through is probably quite familiar to anyone kind of following a kind of Kanban type workflow. We take each of these data sets in turn, prioritize like how much we needed that type of data, like Slack was important to us, Stripe was important, and then we'd prototype a way of getting that data in the right kind of form that we needed. We then set up a reliable ingest, which would run once every hour or on a more regular basis than that. And then set up some rules to clean it and get it in a good shape to be able to report, and then make it available to the team as a kind of production data set. And we did that on repeat through each of the different tools we're using. I think it's something like 70 different tools we have. And one big thing I would just flag up here is that we have so much in Airtable that this was a major problem for us. But something like 250 Airtable bases, which represent different types of work that are going on inside the business, about 2,500 tables within that. And so what we've done is we've made a little utility that every time something changes, every single cell that gets stored in Snowflake as a kind of versioned history. And that's great for being able to reporting about how things change over time, which often these things aren't great at. So getting some high impact, it's really important that once you've got that data, you show some value. So we spoke to senior leaders and we tried to get them off manual data entry and spreadsheets into automated dashboards. And if you're doing a process like this, I definitely aim at that kind of top layer, senior leader level, because they feel the pain most acutely because they want a view across the organization, and that's hard to do often. Then going one level down, I can't believe I'm saying there's multiple North Stars. It seems to be a thing, but every company seems to have them. We have a North Star per team. And a really good way of showing value quickly is to just get that number in an automated way to each team. And that's something we focus on second. And then once we've got all that data in, which I'm glad to say we're kind of nearly there now, you've got a way to look at engagement analytics across everything, across the web experience, but also through every single operational action that's going on in every single one of these low-code tools. Every Zoom attendance, every calendar invite acceptance, that all goes into the mix. And then we get a single view of users and how they're experiencing OnDeck across all of that, which is essentially a combination of product analytics and operational data. So a principle I think that would be worth bearing in mind is that you should try to aim for people to be able to self-serve, product, operations, sales. They should really be able to answer their own questions with whatever tooling you build. In our case, we've tried to make very simple interfaces and dashboards and put the control in the hands of the team. This is an ongoing effort, and this is probably one of the hardest parts for us actually, is getting people to be able to feel like they're data literate. And so what we've done as a kind of interim step is to try to go to where the team are. So folks need their data where they already work. That's the learning we came to. We were having trouble getting people to adopt a new tool. So we're now trying to sync data from our systems into their tools, back into custom products, and basically enable the team to understand and query their own data. And this is a layer that I think would be quite interesting for anyone who's going down a similar path, and is what we're currently working on today. There's a move towards people using their own data warehouse as a kind of customer data platform, essentially making your own API layer that represents all the people that you care about, all your customers, all your users. There's a few products that are doing this. Segment has something called personas. There's Census, which is also offering that, and that's one of the tools we're using. And essentially, you get all your representation of each user and information about them in one place, and then sync it to different systems, like a CRM, or back into your product. And where we're going to here is we'll essentially have that same data in all the different places. So in our own kind of admin area, in HubSpot, CRM, back into the product, but you're not syncing to each of them independently. You kind of have your own platform that does that syncing in one way, which I think is a pattern I think many people could adopt. The end result here is, I think, because we've got this overall picture about what everybody's doing, we're actually able to surface really useful connections for people in the community, make introductions, and like help make their experience even better. And that's one of the big outcomes of this whole process. So conclusions, just to wrap up, I think from having experienced this firsthand in OnDeck and the way that no-code was really adopted kind of across the whole company at an early stage, and it survived so long into the life of the business, I'd say that low-code and no-code approaches are here to stay. And it's likely that as product people, we're going to be seeing more of this. We'll start seeing that product will increasingly be made by non-technical people. They'll be responsible for parts of the end user experience that perhaps you'd love to design or centrally control, but it perhaps sits outside of your remit in much the way that perhaps marketing automation used to. And I think if you're planning forward for a kind of low-code world, then you would plan in some data wrangling as your kind of product surface expands over time. So that's that kind of data infrastructure team that I'm leading, and a low-code infrastructure team to support people to use things in the right way. So hopefully this has some thought-provoking points in here, and it's been great to be able to kind of share our journey so far with OnDeck. We're scaling rapidly, and I would say that none of this has really been possible without thanks to Tasman Analytics, who are a London agency who help startups with their kind of data pipelining, and they've been instrumental in helping us get to where we are today. So a lot of what I shared with you has been a product of a collaboration with them. We'll have some questions at the end, but thanks very much for your time. I'm Steph. You can check us out at beondeck.com. And yeah, looking forward to hearing your questions later. Cheers.
Amazing. Love, great stuff, Steph. Thanks so much. That has been fascinating. I know I have learned more about a whole bunch of tools that I've never heard of in like 15 minutes than I have done in the entire last 6 months. That is awesome. I've got a whole heap of like things to go and Google like really quickly. So yeah, thanks very much, mate. We'll see you back on stage in a little bit for some Q&A. So we are going to bring up now Alison Paul from Flow, who's going to talk to us all about data and how they look at behavior change in some of their, really fascinating and game-changing products. So, Ali, over to you.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. I'm Alison Paul. I'm a senior product manager at Flow, and I'll be talking tonight about measuring the unmeasurable, which is in data and behavior change. Sorry, I think we're having technical issues. There we go. So, as product managers, I think we're pretty good at measuring our products. We're pretty good at engagement metrics, pretty good at business metrics. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is that I think that where we are missing a trick is by not measuring the more emotional side and human side of our products. So you might be wondering, why am I delivering this talk? Because I'm not a behavioural scientist, I'm not a behavioural economist, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm a product manager and I love getting inspiration from other spaces. I worked in innovation many, many years ago, and there was a mantra back then that you should steal with pride from other spaces. And I think that's a really great mantra to have as a product manager. The other caveat with this talk is that I've never seen a perfect working example of what I'm about to talk about. And this is a work in progress for me right now at Flow with our chatbot. So I'm hoping that this might inspire some of you out there to go and give this a whirl and just let me know how you get on. So I've worked in healthcare for over 10 years. And the great thing about healthcare is that it's rich pickings for stealing stuff. So there's just so much inspiration for product managers. There's behavioural change, there's service design, things like patient-reported outcome measures. There's just so much that you can use. I'm also going to be talking about vaginas tonight because I work at Flow. So for the 50% of you who don't have periods, Flow is the largest period tracker in the world right now. We've got 40 million monthly active users. And I run the Flow Health chatbot. So we do chats about things like cramps, discharge, periods, all sorts of things, all related to women's health. And prior to that, I worked for 7 years at Bupa in a number of product roles all over the company. So from things like well-being apps to a startup within a corporate, even in care homes, online GPs, all sorts of things. And for those of you who are watching online who may be not familiar with Bupa, Bupa is a private healthcare insurer in the UK, runs care homes and clinics. It's also a worldwide company as well, operating in different markets. So I'm going to be starting my talk by taking a bit of a pop at the product vision board. I'm not the first product manager to do this at ProductTank, but my pitch tonight is that I think that there are three core business needs, three core needs here. And those are the business needs and the metrics that go with those. So that's where you've got revenue and growth, and you're looking at things like subscriptions, sales, leads. And then with your user needs, I think this is where it needs to break down into the functional needs that we're all pretty familiar with. It's things like you want a product that's quick Simple, easy to use, quick results, value for money. And how you measure that, that's things like MAUs, retention, things like start rate for my chatbot, session time. And then emotional needs. Now, I think these are the sort of underlying drivers that sit behind your functional needs. And these are really the reasons why your product resonates so well with your target audience. So I think a lot of you probably know this stuff because hopefully you've got great researchers, and when your feature or product was at its inception, that there were a lot of insights behind that about why your audience needs your product. But where often things are missing is how you measure those emotional metrics. So what are the ongoing measures that are you going to use to measure your emotional needs? So I think that really key to understanding this is that products really sit on a spectrum between being purely functional and purely emotional. And I've worked in healthcare and charity before that, and these are really emotional products. So, donating to a cancer charity, highly emotional. The startup I worked on at Bupa, we were using a self-pay startup. People were booking cataracts operations. That's a highly complex, high investment purchase that people are making. But I think there are other products which are also equally very emotionally complex. You could argue that booking your holiday is quite emotional at the moment. You want peace of mind that your holiday is going to happen. You want that excitement about your holiday. And then you've got products which are quite functional. You could think that things like banking apps or using Waze to drive your car, these are functional, but they will have some emotional needs sitting around there somewhere. So now I just wanted to have 30 seconds on behavioural change. And this is the Combi model. It's a really popular model that's used probably over at least the last 5 years in behavioural change. And what it means is that there is normally a target behaviour. It's the desired behaviour that you want your users to do. And then there are three kind of main things that make this happen. So there's the capability, and that's the knowledge and skills that your user has to do that behaviour. There's the opportunity, which is physical, social environment that they live in. And this is the interesting bit, which is the motivation. And this is the conscious and unconscious processes, the habits, what helps and hinders your user to do that target behaviour. So this is how it works in the chatbot. So this is a digestive issues chat that we launched in the summer. This is for people who have things like nausea, diarrhea, constipation, bloating with their cycles, so not very pleasant. And what this chat does, it helps users understand whether it's linked to their cycle or whether it might be related to another women's health condition. So it's all about making people more aware. And so the target behaviour here is to really get women to go to the doctor if they notice that something is wrong. And so if you look at the Combi, so where does this sit? What are the drivers here? So we want to improve people's capability to do this. So that's the knowledge and information, improving their confidence to go to the doctor. Opportunity is a bit more tricky for us at Flow because we're not an online GP provider, so you can't book an appointment with Flow. So opportunity, we can probably not quite as helpful here, but what we can really do is help motivate individuals. So we can decrease the anxiety of people, we can give them peer-to-peer support, which is a really excellent behavioural change mechanic to prompt people to go to the doctor. And we can give them reassurance about what are the next steps, what might happen when they go to the doctor. So how do you get from Combi to metrics? So I've got three key tips really for this evening with how you might approach this. So my first tip is to start small. So I think just set one target behaviour and maybe 2 to 3 other measures sitting with Combi if you're going to experiment with this. If you're in healthcare, you have reams and reams of stuff in Combi. But I think if you're going to experiment, just start small with something like this. So with the digestive issues chat, thinking of things like improved intention to see the doctor, improved knowledge, and reduced anxiety. So my second tip is to think about where this sits in your user journey. So where are you going to measure this? and is it repeatable through the journey? So back at Bupa, I worked on a patient support service in COVID. And this was a service for people who were undergoing quite complex procedures. So people who were going through a treatment pathway with like multiple diagnostics and procedures. And what we would be doing is they would be speaking to a nurse, and we were using a website to really help improve their confidence in their decision making. It's called informed decision making in healthcare. So we were measuring that after every single call with the nurse. So my third point is to, oh, James, I think it's frozen. Hang on. Sorry.
Hey, Ali.
Sorry,
okay?
It's back again.
Cool, fabulous.
So my third point is going to be to think about method. You've got to think about what method are you going to use for looking at your measurements. So I think a really great place to start is self-reported, and this is where we're going to be starting with the chatbot. So asking users to self-report on the improvement in their motivation and their behaviours. And that can be really useful because the alternative is doing things like a pre and a post with the intervention that you're doing. I think there's a real opportunity to look at things like Nps and Csat. So obviously in a big corporate organisation like Bupa, Nps is a measure that's taken worldwide across like so many different parts of the organisation. And I think there's a real opportunity to blend outcome measures with things like NPS. So when you're asking if you would recommend a product to friends and family, you can be asking about the impact that it's made and some of the measures that you're looking at. At Flow, we're using Csat as well. So again, this is can be tied in there. I think using scale is really important as well. So thinking about the scale of measurement, the larger the scale, the more kind of interest you can get in accuracy. And then, I think if you're working in health, it's useful to know that there's a lot of validated tools out there already that you might be able to use. So these are things like clinical tools like pain management or mental health tools that are there. So at Bupa, I worked on not one, but two wellbeing apps. First was called Be Me, the second was called, first was called Bupa Boost, second was called Be Me. And both of these apps were about trying to improve people's wellbeing behaviours. And within this app, as you can see, this is the current one, which is Be Me. And there are 8 dials here. So you can easily see like the change in behaviour here as people's behaviour, as people improve their BMI or their sleep might improve with kind of various interventions that are going on. And this is a way of measuring essentially population health. So those are my 3 tips. So I think, start small, define a small set of measures. Number 2, think about where this sits in your user journey and where you're going to measure it. And third, think about the method that you're going to use. And what do you end up with? So I think the great thing about this is that not only do you get evidence that your product works, but by how much, and that's the really important bit. And so finally, I think if you end up with this like golden nugget of information of like how effective your product is, the product marketing team are really going to love you because this is the sort of thing that they will probably use for things like claims in advertising and marketing. And finally, I just wanted to leave you with a very quick message that Flow's hiring at the moment. And in our London office in particular, we've got lots of product, research, design roles. So please drop me a message if you're interested in working at an organisation which is making real impact on women's lives worldwide.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ali. That is fantastic. Such interesting stuff. I'm going to be talking about vaginas is definitely the best intro to any ProductTank session we have ever had. So yeah, spot on from there and all the way through. Thank you very much. So folks, we've got getting some great questions in through Slido and on the YouTube chat. Please do keep them coming for all of our speakers tonight. We'll get through to them at the end. In the meantime, we have got the fantastic Randy fresh off the Mind the Product stage in London here last week to high acclaim. He's going to talk to us all about his experience of data whilst he was director of the NHS COVID-19 app. So, Randeep, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, James. Hopefully you can all hear me. This is a bit of the graveyard shift, so apologies. It's both bad that I'm not in person, but possibly good because I can't see the disappointment in your eyes. I can just assume there's a sea of kind of happy people at the other side. So I'm a director. I was a director at the NHS Test and Trace app. I'll come introduce what that meant. For the international viewers, the Test and Trace app was a COVID-19 notification app. It was a contact tracing app that would let you know if you're close to someone who tested positive for COVID. So what I'm here to talk about is my experience working there. Given we're talking about health tech, I'm going to start by talking about something that I was told early in my health tech career. And I think it's very relevant to data science. A product that you build will kill someone. A decision that you make will kill someone. So the important thing as a product person in health tech is to make sure you do things to make your conscience clear. You have done what you can to make sure that you're making safe, knowledgeable, and healthy decisions. Now you're all like, why the hell did I join this talk? This sounds so depressing. But actually, it's not going to be. I think it's more setting the scene for something that's quite serious and actually highlighting that data science and data is really, really crucial in health technology to make sure you make the right decision. So I promise it's uphill from here. So what I'm going to focus on is talking about this as I talk. These talks are often a form of therapy. And I'm going to focus on data science and this thing that's called the pingdemic. I'll come to that later. But to kick off, just to introduce myself. So my name's Randeep. I am a kind of a VP CPO. But my experience is I've done strategy consultancy, which is very useful in the kind of chaotic worlds that I work in. But I started my career setting up a charity called Teach First. So I was a teacher for a couple of years working to grow this charity. And more recently, I work on the board in my spare time of a sexual health charity. But most of my experience in product has been in healthcare. So I was at 3 years at Babylon Health, which listed on the New York Stock Exchange on Friday. I'm doing some work with the Alan Turing Institute, but the thing I'm going to talk about here is the NHS COVID-19 app. So, talking about that, I'll take, if you will, take your mind back to June last year. So, especially if you're in the UK, in June 2020, the NHS were building a COVID-19 app. They spent 2 or 3 months building it, and mid to end June in 2020, the app was not launched, and publicly it was shelved. Now, it was in this environment that I was called out of the blue and asked if I could join the government and the NHS to build the follow-on app to this one. Now, the reason I mentioned this, there's a bunch of good people working on this app. It wasn't a bad app per se, but the lessons from that app were quite important for data scientists. So this first app that was built was aiming to centralize and use your phone to collect data. The key purpose of it was notification of people, but doing that in a way that the data science could collect as much information as it could about where you were, what time you were located, and to identify breakouts. And so the idea was it was built kind of data science first, thinking about the epidemiology, e.g. the science of spreading disease. It wasn't anonymous fully. It had a centralized database that would collect all that data. And it was attempting to use iPhones and Android phones to use their Bluetooth to continuously monitor who was around you. So the tech itself was not really privacy preserving and worked against the Google and Apple operating systems, which caused problems. But as much as that wasn't a successful strategy, it's worth noting that in June 2020, we didn't actually know that much. We just didn't know how much COVID spread. We didn't know how to protect yourself. We didn't know much about the new variants that have emerged subsequently. So it was in this environment that I chose, some may have said stupidly at the time, to join government and try and build this new app. So I left Babylon with 3 days notice. So they called me on a Tuesday night. On Wednesday morning, I spoke to Babylon. On Friday, I left. So it was very, very quick for me to get out. And then I joined quite an interesting environment where there was no product team. There was an understanding of data science, and we had to grow and move quite quickly. So July 2020, pretty much when I joined, it was having to move quite fast. I'm going to focus this talk much more on the data science of it, but I think, as James mentioned, there will be a Mind the Product talk I did about the app more generally, which will be, I think, published somehow, which you can access and see more of the experience of the rest of it. But I'll focus on the app goal. So I quickly joined and realized that the app needed to break the trains of transmission. Its goal was to stop COVID spreading. Now that sounds kind of obvious, but how you do that was about making sure, unlike the first app, this app is anonymous for multiple reasons about access, making sure people at the bottom of the pyramid would like and trust this. The app needed to be anonymous. It had to be universal so everyone could use it. And given how much uncertainty we had about COVID, we had to use data science to reduce this uncertainty. It was an overt goal of the app to use data science. So when the first app was built as a scientific study survey tool, this app had to be much more user-focused. So I was keen not just to use data science to track the disease, but also to use science data to try and work out what people wanted. So the thing that was different is I also studied quite quickly the emotional drivers of risk. Data isn't just about cold, hard facts. It can also be about emotions. So what we asked was, what were the drivers of COVID for you? What were the risk drivers? So if you take a step back and think about June, July last year, when I said, what's your worry about COVID? For most people, it was about protecting their loved ones. My grandmother's vulnerable, my mum, my daughter, my son's got some sort of disease. Something about protecting your loved ones. Because most people didn't worry about catching it themselves. They thought they were kind of invincible. And the public benefit aspect, which is what the first app was built around, this kind of queen and country, everyone will donate their information for free to protect everyone else. That was much lower down in the order of what was important. So using that information, we focused on building an MVP, which focused on the contact tracing being about protecting your loved ones and the other features that are protecting you and protecting the general public being second order. But a key thing we needed to do was define the data we could collect. So as I mentioned before, the app was anonymous by design, and that was crucial to get vulnerable people to trust and use this app. And ultimately was something that's really important to me because I didn't want to, this was a new paradigm, a new model of how to collect data on people. I was quite conscious that this could establish a pattern of people just giving up their data to the government in a very open way. And that was important that we didn't do that. So we had to define what data we wanted to collect and then pitch to make sure it could get collected. Unlike apps that maybe I've used in the past and you guys all build often, you couldn't just collect every parameter and then measure it offline and see what was interesting. You had to think in advance as a discipline, what data do I need? What data is important? How do I measure it? So that was useful because we defined some parameters of what we thought was useful for now, what could be useful. It was a couple of bets we took, but everything that we were going to collect had to be agreed by pretty much most of these pictures here. So we actually had something called a DPIA, which is a data protection impact assessment, which was public. So anything we collected was publicly announced so people could measure, could challenge us about whether it was good or bad. So it's quite a challenging environment to collect data, and it limited what we could collect, but it was quite a useful discipline to think almost as a pre-mortem, what would be useful? What might be useful in the future to collect? Because we needed to collect it now in case that became useful. So that was the environment. So 6 weeks after joining, we had a pilot. 5 to 6 weeks after that, we had a national launch. And if you see the talk on Mind the Product, you'll hear about how the pilot, which was also a data gathering exercise, we managed to get into Newham, which was a very diverse borough in London, which was the hard place to test, but the right place to test. So we launched. The pilot phase was quite important to get some data on the ground level about what was happening with the app. But we launched on the 24th of September, and within 8 days, within 4 days, we were the fastest downloaded app in UK history. I'll mention as passing, my partner's appendix burst 3 days before national launch. So that was, I would have put a picture of him in hospital, but he doesn't like me showing that. So I'll just leave it as quite a challenging week in my life. But what we did manage to do was one of the measures we did was the algorithm that determined how likely you were to catch COVID or how much your exposure was. We built an algorithm that could rank and bucket people. So a low risk would be someone who was maybe exposed enough to think they caught it, whereas a red was someone who was very, very highly exposed, we believe. So what we did was here's a map here's a graph showing the number of alerts that we sent out from October 2020 to April 2021. And as you can see, there was a peak around January, which coincided with a kind of a week after Christmas, as you can see. But you can see the reds and oranges showing the higher risk exposures versus the yellows. So great, we sent lots of alerts out. But what was interesting is, another thing we were measuring is exposure notifications. So say I test positive, in the app, I can alert the app that I've been exposed to COVID. How many people are alerted by that anonymously? What we realized is by measuring in an aggregate anonymous kind of way, we could work out regions where lots more people were being notified by a single person. And we could use that to predict with about a week's notice where an outbreak might be occurring. So that was super useful for being able to determine where mobile testing units or later vaccination sites could go to target areas where we think with some lead time, COVID outbreaks could occur because we could see the transmissions in real time. So that was there was lots of other bets that we took on data that didn't necessarily work out, but that turned out to be a gem of a data point that we could use to actually predict lots of modeling. So great. We did that. Happy days. In May this year, Nature, the journal, published a paper which proved the app worked and potentially conservatively prevented up to 900,000 infections when there was only 1.9 million people infected at that point in the UK. So brilliant, great. Data science, we built some measures of data science into the app so that this paper could even be generated so we could prove that it was working. And the app, great, was a great success. 28 million downloads, proven to reduce the spread of COVID, 250 million check-ins. But then things got strange. So in June 2021, this term was given, the pingdemic, the idea that the app was now telling many, many people that they should lock down, that they've been exposed to COVID and therefore they shouldn't go out. So the app had gone from being a kind of, it's actually quite interesting if you think about product cycle. So when I joined, the app was a failure. It was destined to be a failure. It would never work. Then it launched and it was begrudgingly accepted, but still kind of hated. Then people complained. Then they were kind of indifferent to it. Then some people started liking it when they realized it was kind of benign and actually they could check in easier than having to sign in their books. Some people were told to isolate that made them feel safe. Then it turned into a potential success. And then it went back around to hate, where everyone just thought, oh my God, this is awful. So this is a kind of a weird psychological product cycle. But at this point, people thought this app was like the Terminator or HAL, trying to shut down the economy, damage people. It was very unhealthy and very unsafe. So not a great situation. If we go back to when we were planning some of the data that we measured came in useful to understand what was happening in this pandemic. And I'm going to specifically shout out Christoph Fraser, who's a professor at Oxford, and Mark Bryars, who's currently Chief Data Officer at the Royal Mail, but was previously at the Turing Institute, both of whom I worked quite closely with. But those guys are geniuses, because what we saw was this. So this is the same graph I showed you earlier from September to April, but stretched to kind of closer to today. So we were told, or I was hearing many, many times, that this pandemic meant that the nation was being shut down, the app was out of control, things were crazy. If you look at the number of alerts we actually sent less alerts in July than we did in January. And if you look at the ratio of reds to yellows, there's more reds. So not only were we sending fewer alerts, a higher proportion of them were high risk. So the app hasn't suddenly gone haywire and just spamming people left, right, and center. So what is going on? If you look at the data of how many alerts we were sending out against how many people told the app that they were testing positive, apart from the log scale on the left-hand side, what you can see is in orange, the number of people who told the app that they had COVID, and in blue, the number of people who were alerted. They're in lockstep. So the app wasn't doing something weird by mistakenly spamming lots of people or spamming loads of people who have tested positive. So what is happening? If we go back to that predictive indicator I talked about earlier, which is if I Randeep test positive and I put in the app, I've got COVID, how many people do I get alert? How many people do I alert? Looking at the graph, you can see from January till May, most people who tested positive on average notified 2 other people. All of this is anonymous. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they are necessarily. But then what happens is from May the 18th onwards, which anyone in the UK would know is the day that we reopened the economy and people could start mixing, any person who tests positive then notifies up to 8 people. So this pandemic was a result of people mixing more, which sounds really obvious, but we actually have the science to prove what was happening. And that can also feed back to epidemiologists, scientists to help modify policy and improve things. So that was a quick part of history about some of the data science. I mean, of course, there's so much more detail and so many more stories there, but in 15 minutes, I wanted to give you a quick overview. And, I am proud of getting disease off the street. And a moment of personal pride is, getting disease off the street. So, it's interesting to be able to say that something you've built has had both a scary and hopefully a helpful impact on some parts of the UK. And if I'm going to leave you with a few points, I think the points would be thinking about how data science isn't just hard, cold numbers, but also something that's more emotional. Thinking about how you can plan in advance what data science you need, what it can tell you, almost taking bets on data science, going, it's a really interesting discipline to be forced to justify everything you collect and think what can or can't be used. We did some really interesting work with Alan Turing Institute about just predicting stuff. And there's this whole question, which I haven't got time to talk about how we could have used it also to predict how Delta strain and other variants could be stopped. But we weren't allowed to collect that data or add it into the app, information about vaccines. But ultimately, it's about elevating data science to not just be a backroom function, to make everyone in the business think about how useful that is. So I'll stop there. And before I finish, I'm going to risk playing a video on this, which may or may not work. But back to, if you remember when the first activities I did when I joined Test and Trace was to look at the emotional resonance, do some research about what people want. The primary reason people were worried about COVID was because they wanted to protect their loved ones. Now, hopefully, James, you might have to shout if you can't hear this, but I'm going to play a 1-minute video, which is the advert that launched the Test and Trace app.
Sarah. That's Edie. This is Bella. Maya, Lily, Nicola, Kim, Caitlin, my son, my girlfriend, my husband, my 2 kids, is my father, my dog, that's my mom, this is my brother, my wife, my grandson, my wife to be, yeah, my wife, my little brother, my dad, and my dog. He was a miracle. They're my heartbeat. We're going out for 2 years. It made me smile every day. It's a here to my throne. She's the most important person in the world for me. I didn't love him when I first met him. He just grew on me. She's my life. Grandpa! You don't have a hair! Why don't you have a picture of me? First love. First love. Even when he steals my ice cream, a stunning woman in the room, and I just gravitate towards you. Just the way that she says things are funny. He doesn't love a face like that. She's amazing. Everyone you love is on your phone. You've just been there for every pivotal moment of my life. Now, so is the app that helps protect them from coronavirus. Love you, Mum. Protect your loved ones. Get the app.
Oh, no, go. And with that, I'll say thank you. Feel free to connect with your LinkedIn, reach out for advice, questions, or any other thoughts. So I think I will go back. I think that's me. Over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Andy. That was awesome. What a lovely way to finish it with that video as well. Nice, great insight into, as you say, the human side of things. Brilliant. I suspect you might be giving that talk a few times over the next couple of years, or versions of it. That is
reach out if you do, but yeah.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Cool. So, folks, as I say, we've got a few questions already in the chat and on Slido. We'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can do. But keep adding them in. Steph, I'll go back to you first off, if that's all right. If you were going back into a more, an environment with more code-led, kind of products and services, what lessons would you take that you picked up on deck back into that environment?
It's a really different mindset working with low code and no code tools, because as a software developer or someone who's been working in building products for a long time, you're used to just kind of specifying what needs to be made, and then the logical things to jump into solving it by way of building it with some code, whatever it is. And I think nowadays, something I've noticed about myself and those around me is we've got a bit of an instinct where before jumping into code, you essentially just need to look around a little bit more. Think about, is the thing you're trying to solve something that could be solved by a tool you could buy off the shelf or configure slightly versus starting it from scratch? And I've seen so many teams build out the same kind of stuff all the time. It's like, a few years ago, it would have been authentication systems for websites. Everyone had their own login password things, and they're getting more and more complex. And then people came along and said, okay, look, how about we make one really good one? And then everyone uses that. And then a few people did the same. But the same kind of things apply here. When you're facing a problem, maybe look around and see if it's already been solved or available. And that requires different skills. You need to be more like an analyst. And if you behave like an analyst, it's more about researching a market, looking at who the leaders are, seeing if they're healthy, getting on calls with the founders if you can, like checking out the docs, like doing as much due diligence as you can on whatever tools you use. And I think that's a product role. I think that's on a team. The product person could do a lot of that evaluation. It doesn't necessarily have to be technical. Certainly on our team, we see some of those decisions are made by more product-led people who go out and scout. So yes, I would say a skill to develop would be scouting, due diligence, and kind of research on the tools.
Awesome, thanks, Steph. That's super interesting. Ali, got a question for yourself. So where, you said at the beginning, you're not a behavioral scientist, but an enthusiastic, I don't want to say amateur, that's not right, but certainly an enthusiastic admirer of behavioral analysts. But where do you keep up to date about this kind of stuff? Where have you picked it up? Where do you find the latest things that steal, as you said?
Yeah, I mean, I was quite lucky because I worked at Cancer Research UK in the beginning of my career, and it was steeped in behavioural change. It was actually called social marketing about 15 years ago, if anybody remembers that. So it was, yeah, there was a lot of great work, and I learned a lot going to kind of behavioural change conferences right at the start of my career. But at Bupa, they eventually set up a behavioural change team. It was definitely hard to embed it in the organisation, but I do think it was done successfully. As I was leaving, there was a team, and as product managers, we'd work pretty closely with the behavioural insights team. So on a lot of my projects, I was sort of working in partnership with them. And then, yeah, like I've managed to follow like a number of agencies who are always sort of showing like what's going on in other sectors. It's always quite interesting seeing what's going on in like local government, doing an awful lot of quite interesting behavioural change stuff. And then I follow think tanks as well. So, you know, in health, there's people like the King's Fund. So I keep an eye on what goes on in the public health space, obviously, as well as like in the private sector.
Awesome, cool. Thanks, Harry. Actually, a follow-up question from someone. They were asking, what kind of social listening tools are you using to understand some of those kind of behavioural side of things? Are you using any social listening tools for stuff like that?
So yeah, in terms of social listening, so the interesting thing about Flow is that we do have a community. So so we have a community part of the Flow app called Secret Chats. So I have, it's just brilliant. I have an awful lot of insights that I can draw on from what people are saying on our forums. So that's really interesting. So when I'm starting a new chat, like, you know, the first place I go to is Secret Chats forum to see what people are saying about it. But I also do use things within the chat to get people's feedback. We have open text nodes and a lot of chats following things like CSAT scores. So I've got like that kind of feedback loop coming through with you know, whether we're meeting their expectations, whether they're not, you know, and what people want and need, along with all the user research tools that we have anyway at Flow.
Brilliant. That's like, yeah, that's a dream to have that kind of insight like on tap, right? I bet. Awesome, cool. So Randy, coming to yourself, had a nice question here in the chat about what lessons would you take out of that COVID-19 app experience? I mean, obviously we all hope, right, it's going to be a fairly unique one for us all, but what would you take into, you know, your next project, either whether that's Babylon or anywhere else? What lessons have you got?
So I think actually I just want to pick up what Ali said originally, which was talking about behavioral insights. But my background was behavioral ecology, evolutionary biology. Not that I do that much of it now, but we actually did a lot of work which I didn't talk about with the behavioral insights team. So I think it's really important to have that way of thinking, because in health, you think really overtly about changing user behavior. And sometimes if you watch the other talk, you know, a lot of people talk about user behavior at the top, but they forget the foundational parts that make behavior change. Like, you can only change your behavior if you can access the app or service. So if you haven't got access to the thing, how are you going to use it to change? If you don't understand how it works, or it's not in your language, how are you going to change? So I do think there's something that's useful and universal in healthcare to think more generally for the products we build, and those behavioral triggers. So I think that's something just generally that I think is useful, which is kind of universal. Specifically from the COVID app, I think there's a few things. One is the difference between diversity and inclusion. Now, you may hear these terms bandied about, but just for kind of clarity, diversity is having different colors and people and different backgrounds on a team. Great, that's amazing. Inclusion is more important, where those people have a voice and an ability to change the direction. If you have window dressing that doesn't change anything, that makes you feel morally good but doesn't do anything. And I think that's something that we really should consider and think about. Product people make decisions. Data is used to help power those decisions. So it's sort of thinking about how our teams are staffed, helping get more people into our community, but then also using them to make sure we're building data to back up our assertions. So it's not just our teams that have to be diverse and inclusive. The data that we gather has to be from diverse sources and diverse people and inclusive. So at Test and Trace, it was actually a bit of a challenge to get specific data from those communities most impacted and dying from COVID. And that's an extreme example, but that's relevant to anyone. If you're building a app or a service, make sure that the research to do with the most important or marginalized users is there and is being used to drive different product decisions, because otherwise it's pointless. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. Second thing I'd say is actually it was really weirdly creative using data, because we were so limited with what we could do. And I was working with some amazing people from like the Alan Turing Institute. No one knew what COVID was. It was so weird. So we actually would sit down and I would try and be like a data product manager by saying some of these measures, could you use the number of people that are notified by an app? Is that useful for you? I think you could use it for this. And they'd go, yes or no. Or they'd do a little bit of a proof of concept to come back. And they'd say, Randy, can you tell me this parameter? Why? Because if you give me that, I can add this and give you something else. So not just making data the preserve of the data scientists, everyone kind of spitballing and thinking about it together. So those are two things. And finally, I think every product manager, like impact. Often we get so frustrated in our day-to-day drudge that we kind of don't always communicate the impact of what we're looking for. And sometimes when you get tired, you can't push any harder. So sometimes you just need to get someone that's kind of your foot soldier, or someone who can kind of be your wingman or woman to come alongside you and go, I haven't got the energy to fight for this. Can you just help me fight this battle to get this data? And that was another thing that I found. So hopefully probably a long answer for you, but that was something that's really useful.
Yeah, no. That's fantastic. We had a couple of follow-up questions actually about how did you define some of that original data that you were collecting. So lovely to hear that relationship with scientists and how that built on top of each other. It's really interesting.
So I think you broke up. What was the question again?
Cool. So just Steph, I'm gonna. No, it's okay, mate. I was just saying it followed on really nicely. Sorry, I think that was my side. Steph, I'm going to come back to you. Had a nice question through Slido about how would you expect, maybe this hasn't been something on deck, but how would you expect the conversations to go with engineers when you start to move towards low code? Perhaps if you're in an organization that's traditionally created quite a lot of its own tools, like you mentioned in your first answer, I'm sure everyone here could imagine that being a difficult conversation. Is that one you've had? Any tips or thoughts or reflections on how you would tackle it?
It's a really interesting point, because a lot of people have been talking about how AI tools and automation are going to impact on employment, and people were seriously concerned about entire sectors being heavily impacted by tools that could replace knowledge worker type jobs. I think when it comes to software and design and product, there's a general feeling that, no, we're kind of immune from a lot of that because coding is hard and you can't really get a computer to do some of that. And I think you're probably right. You will get a sense that, hang on, this is my job. Are you trying to kind of code me out of a job by using something off the shelf? In this situation, I tend to talk about the additional abilities you get as a developer in this kind of environment. There's a lot of busy work in software. There's a lot of data crunching that isn't particularly fun. It's the kind of work that you just have to do to get to the good stuff. There's a kind of like classic diagram of systems thinking where it's data, knowledge, wisdom in a kind of triangle. I'm trying to draw it out with my hands here. And a lot of the energy in data engineering goes into that preparation layer. It's like wiring things up, getting things in the right shape. And eventually you can get to the point where you can reason about it. And then eventually you can apply some machine learning and do all the interesting stuff. Most people kind of want to be in that kind of interesting layer rather than the kind of data prep cleaning layer, because it's the kind of work that doesn't end. It's the plumbing of the situation. So I think generally I would say it enables developers to move up the stack, kind of to higher order concerns. I think that's probably quite an attractive position to be in. I also believe that because we're adding more and more data all the time, this isn't a situation where we're going to be removing many kind of immediate jobs from like being part of the mix. But it is true that right now, if someone were to say to me today, I want to build this very simple mobile app, and I'd maybe ask them a few questions about what they want to do. And if nothing in there sounded particularly unusual, then I would point them to an off-the-shelf web app builder or a mobile app builder, because you can quite literally build things from scratch just in a browser now without having to write any lines of code. I did as kind of a side project. I helped someone with this quite recently to build a low-code mobile app, and it's actually possible. You can do that stuff now. So I think the conversation could be quite challenging with freelancers who are relying on those kinds of projects for their living. I think they could be there was a dangerous point there. So for me, in a team, it's about higher order concerns, but I don't think that resolves the kind of ecosystem question, which I think actually is at risk. I think that a lot of people who are doing freelance app development should probably spend a bit of time learning how to do low-code tools.
Okay, that's interesting. Cool. I was going to ask, where would you start? So what were the tools that you were developing a low-code app in for your mate? What would you get people to play with first off if they're in that position?
There's a few that are really good now. If you don't care about mobile, as in being in the mobile app store, if you don't care about like it's in the Google store or in the Apple store, then Bubble is pretty amazing. I think you can do quite substantial things just on that now. I think the companies getting funded who have started out as Bubble apps, like they're getting investment behind them, because you're essentially removing the risk on what you're building by validating it with the community, and then if it doesn't work, well, you haven't lost much. So the cost to entry is low. And the other one would be Adalo, as in Ada Lovelace, but without the lace on the end. And that is a mobile app builder. It's doing some great stuff. So there's some really good tools out there.
Okay, awesome. I've written them down on a post. I suspect a whole bunch of people at home have done the same.
I think I need to give you a list.
yeah, that'd be fantastic. Read that afterwards. Perfect. Right. So just one last question for everyone, actually. And sorry, my internet is failing me, I think. But it's time to crack on. But just there's a question that comes through. How do you make decisions when you've got limited data? It'll look a little bit different for everybody, I'm sure. But Ali, where do you lean to when when you need to make a data-informed decision, but you haven't got that single metric to help guide you? What's your process?
I have been in this situation, even in places like Bupa. You're working with quite archaic data systems, not talking to each other. So it's it can be really challenging. I think when I've been in this situation, I've had to rely very heavily on user research. If you can't make, because the ideal thing is to make data-driven decisions alongside, user insight, and having both of those to make decisions. And when you can't, I feel like relying on the user insights and the research and prototyping and testing and all of that can help give you some of the answers. If you're in that situation, it can be really difficult not to have all the data at your fingertips.
Cool. Randy, any thoughts for how you approach that?
So I suppose it depends on whether you're talking about quant data or qual data, because when it comes to quantitative stuff, sometimes it's just not the users, it's not the ability for you to be able to kind of do very much. And then at that point, because there's also sometimes with the quant data, you're often we had some scientific reports coming out of the work we did. So sometimes there wasn't enough data, but there was enough data for me to make a rough decision. It wasn't enough for being published. So I think sometimes thinking about not in a kind of proving something way, but just is it higher or lower? Sometimes it's just indicative, and you're like, well, enough of my measures are going higher that I'm just going to take a punt. But when it comes to qual and sometimes quant as well, I spoke about using proxies for some of this data. So, for example, if you're doing user research and you can't get, we did research with minority groups or people who are underrepresented, people working, suffering from domestic abuse, LGBT community, we could often use proxies for that to say, we're going to speak to a group who knows a lot about those users. And what they could do is they had lived experience that they could share with us. So it's almost like concentrated information. They could then go out to their users and say, I'm going to speak to us. We're going to survey some of our users, or just do some of that groundwork for you. So I think that proxies are useful because often you can use them to also do some qual stuff. But that's probably more user focused than you were thinking. Those are two things we found quite useful.
I'll take a kind of more software product angle on it, rather than repeating what's been said. I'd say actually the way we've built OnDeck so far is based on a lot of gut instinct rather than looking at statistically significant data. Like, we don't have a set of users that are active enough in the product, like what we call the product, to be able to get to significance in the length of time that we need to make product decisions. There's a classic problem where you have kind of high value, low frequency users, like enterprise products, typically bad at this because there's no way of running an experiment or an A/B test with any kind of reasonable time to be able to have an impact on the product. So you're reliant on tools like Full Story, which I mentioned in my presentation, where essentially you're just making videos about how people are using the app, and then you're sitting there watching them and looking through what people are doing and seeing where the weird gotchas are, and then making improvements. I think those kinds of observational tools are very helpful if you've got a digital product. The other thing is that we have a lot of connection with our users. So if you have direct connections with people, then trying to get a two-way loop where there's a feeling of trust and feedback being received and acted on can end up with a very virtuous circle. So we have that in that when something's going wrong, we go and do something about it. We tell the users reported it, and then they come back with some more stuff. So having an ongoing connection with the users rather than just observational is also quite important. The other one I would say is leaning on experts. Like, people who have a lot of domain knowledge can shortcut some of your experiments. Like, you don't necessarily need to experiment on all of the basic stuff to get to the point where you can have impact. Sometimes you can just rely on someone who knows a lot about a subject area to just tell you roughly how it needs to be, and then you've cut the problem down by 90%. A lot of the way that lean and agile folks talk about this is you should always have experiments even to prove the basics, but that's great if you've got volume. If you don't have volume, I just don't think you're going to get anywhere. So I'm a bit more of a pragmatist nowadays.
Brilliant.
I echo a lot of what you just said there, because at the startup I worked on at Beeper, we didn't have an experiment service at all. We weren't able to do things like A/B testing. And so, yeah, I relied on some of those observation tools like Hotjar and doing exit surveys on the site that I was running. And I spoke to patients who used Beeper on Demand as well. So I sat and did like depth interviews myself, again, because I didn't have a research team or anything like that. So yeah, we didn't have the greatest analytics setup for this startup with where we were at this point. But a lot of that was really helpful for us making decisions on what we were going to do with our roadmap. So yeah, really good.
And I think there's a lot of data sometimes hidden in places you wouldn't expect. Like, reviews are hit or miss, but actually on an aggregate basis, user reviews, feedback on, we actually engaged with people on the app stores to kind of, when they ask a question, engage with them back to go a bit deeper, because someone's bothered writing a negative review. So what is it that they had a problem with? Is there something there that we're missing? And actually, sometimes we could target things that are quite specific, because for someone to be annoyed enough to write a negative review, they must have found something bad. So that was also useful for us.
Brilliant.
Yeah, we use that a lot at Flow. We have a huge channel of customer reviews coming in as a major feedback source for us with developing new features and ideas and responding to issues and all sorts. So yes.
I think sometimes it can be quite dismissive. Sometimes you're like, okay, fine, here's a response. It's actually, no, let's get a product person to go, let me get on a call with you to understand what your user journey was. because something went wrong. Either we explained it to you wrong or you did something wrong, but either way, we need to fix something. So actually going the step beyond to kind of getting them on a call with us to work out what happened was quite useful, beyond just kind of, thank you for your concern, we'll send it to our team.
That's awesome. I love that we're probably going to finish up here with the end of a data and analytics talk being go and talk to people, as opposed to look at numbers. That feels nice and human centric and all the good stuff. So folks, thank you so much for your time, Randy, Steph, Ali. It's been a really, really great session. Really appreciate it, and hopefully see you all again soon. And check back in on ProductTank. We're hopefully going to have an in-person event at the end of November in London. And if not, then certainly at the beginning of next year. So we'll hopefully see you all again soon. Cheers, folks. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.